At 4:47 p.m. on September 3, 2001, Ranger Daniel Carter radioed the district office to confirm that his 6-year-old son was playing near the equipment shed, 40 yards from where he stood. It was the last confirmed sighting of Ethan Carter. When Daniel turned around 11 minutes later, the boy was gone. The campground sat at the edge of a national forest in western Montana, closed to the public for the season but still used by rangers finishing end-of-year maintenance. Daniel had brought Ethan along that Sunday, as he sometimes did, expecting a quiet afternoon of checking trail markers before the site shut down for winter. There was no crowd, no strangers wandering the grounds. Just Daniel, 2 other staff members clearing brush near the ranger station, and a boy in a red jacket who liked to stay close. Ethan had a habit Daniel still describes without being asked. He narrated things, not to anyone in particular, just a running commentary under his breath as he moved, naming what he saw. A beetle on a log, a pine cone shaped like a rocket. Daniel had learned to track his son almost by sound alone, the small voice drifting somewhere nearby while he worked. That afternoon, at some point between 4:47 and 4:58, the voice stopped, and Daniel didn't notice the silence until he called out, and nothing answered it. He remembers the specific stupidity of the first 60 seconds, how he checked behind the shed before he checked anywhere that made sense, because a parent's mind goes first to the place a child was standing, not the places a child could have gone. He remembers the sound of his own boots on gravel, faster than he meant them to be, and the particular quality of a forest that has, without warning, stopped feeling familiar. Daniel called his son's name. No answer. He checked the shed, the parking area, the tree line. Within 20 minutes, he had radioed dispatch, his voice level enough that the dispatcher on duty that day, a woman named Carol Hensley, later said she almost didn't register the urgency until she heard him repeat the boy's full name twice, unprompted. A habit, she said, of someone trying to make something real by saying it out loud. Before we go further into what investigators found and what they didn't, I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has been with this channel for a while and welcome anyone joining us for the first time. If you find value in cases reconstructed carefully from real investigative patterns, consider subscribing. Now, back to that Sunday in September. Within the hour, the first search teams were on the ground. By nightfall, the case had escalated to a multi-agency search. County sheriff's deputies, Forest Service personnel, and volunteers from 3 surrounding towns, working under floodlights against terrain that swallowed sound. Temperatures at that elevation drop fast once the sun goes down, even in early September, and by 9 p.m. searchers were working in jackets zipped to the collar, breath visible in the beam of their flashlights. Daniel walked a section of the Eastern Ridge himself that first night, against the advice of the incident commander, who wanted him near the command post in case Ethan wandered back on his own. Daniel couldn't sit still long enough to accept that logic. He has described the search that night less as looking for his son and more as an attempt to outwalk a feeling he couldn't name. The specific helplessness of a man who had spent 9 years learning a landscape well enough to trust it, discovering in a single afternoon that trust had been misplaced. What made the case difficult from the very first hours wasn't a lack of effort. It was the absence of anything to follow. No torn clothing on brush, no footprints past the gravel lot, no witness who remembered a car they shouldn't have. A 6-year-old had been steps from his father, in a place his father had patrolled for 9 years, and then he simply wasn't there. By the second morning, the search had grown to more than 200 people. Search and rescue dogs were flown in from Missoula. A helicopter equipped with thermal imaging swept the ridgeline twice before weather grounded it. Sheriff's deputies walked the service roads that connected the campground to the highway, looking for tire marks, discarded items, anything. Daniel Carter would later describe those first 72 hours as the moment his understanding of the forest, a place he had spent his career learning, collapsed into something unfamiliar. I knew every ridge, every drainage, every place a kid could wander into and get turned around, he told investigators in a taped statement years later, and none of it made sense for what happened. What would you have done, standing in a place you thought you knew completely, watching it refuse to give you an answer? This story is a fictional narrative inspired by the kinds of real situations families and investigators face when a child goes missing in a remote area. It is written for entertainment and reflection, and any resemblance to real individuals or cases is coincidental. By the fifth day, 3 theories had taken shape, and none of them held together cleanly. The first was the simplest. Ethan had wandered off and suffered an accident. A fall near the creek bed, exposure overnight, something the terrain itself could explain without anyone else's involvement. Search teams concentrated heavily on this possibility for the first 4 days, covering the drainage basin twice and dragging sections of the creek where the current pooled. One of the volunteers on that grid was a retired school teacher named Judith Farrow, who had taught in the county for 30 years and knew half the search party by name. She remembers walking a line through waist-high brush with 11 others, arm's length apart, moving at a pace slow enough that a boot could catch on something the eye would miss. "You develop a kind of tunnel vision," she said. "You're not looking at the forest anymore. You're looking at the 6 inches directly in front of your feet, over and over for hours." On the third pass through the same stretch of ground, she found a child's shoe half buried near a fallen log. And for 11 minutes, before a deputy confirmed the size didn't match, the entire search line held its breath. It didn't match. It belonged to a hiker who'd passed through weeks earlier, its laces rotted enough to suggest it had been there since midsummer. Judith still remembers the specific shame of feeling relieved and disappointed in the same breath. Relieved it wasn't Ethan's. Disappointed that meant they still didn't have anything. Search teams found no signs a child had passed through the underbrush at all, which investigators noted was itself unusual. 6-year-olds rarely move through forest without leaving some trace: a broken twig, a scuffed patch of dirt, a snagged thread. The absence of any of that became, in its own way, a piece of evidence, though not one that pointed anywhere. The second theory was abduction, opportunistic and unconnected to anyone at the site. The campground, though officially closed, sat less than 2 miles from a state highway, and investigators pulled toll and gas station records from 3 counties, looking for any vehicle that had passed through the area without a clear reason to be there. Dozens of leads were logged. A trucker who'd stopped to check a load. A family who'd taken a wrong exit and doubled back. Each one interviewed, each one cleared, each clearance costing days the case didn't have to spare. One lead consumed nearly 2 weeks. A man seen at a gas station 11 miles from the park, paying in cash, driving a van with out-of-state plates. Deputies traced the van to a rental agency in Spokane and through it to a traveling contractor who had, it turned out, no connection to Montana at all that week. A paperwork error had listed the wrong return date on his rental agreement, placing him in the state on a day he'd actually already crossed back into Idaho. Detective work, Ruiz would say years later, is often just this: proving someone innocent so thoroughly that you can finally stop looking at them. The third theory was the hardest for Daniel Carter to sit with: that whoever took his son knew the property, knew the schedule, knew that his Sunday in early September meant reduced staff and no public visitors. Investigators quietly built a list of everyone with legitimate access to the grounds that weekend: seasonal maintenance workers, a groundskeeping contractor, 2 other rangers. Each was interviewed. Each had an account of their whereabouts that, at the time, checked out well enough to move on. Daniel remembers sitting across from a detective. Not Ruiz yet. This was the original investigator, a man named Otis Bell. While Bell read through the list of names out loud, asking Daniel, without quite asking, whether any of them had ever made him uneasy. "I wanted so badly to give him a name," Daniel said. "Any name. Just so there'd be something to point the search at instead of the woods. But I didn't have one. Nobody on that list had ever done anything that would have made me look twice. That absence, no name that fit, no gut instinct to chase, became its own quiet torment. A parent can survive suspecting someone. What Daniel found harder was suspecting no one and having nowhere for the fear to land. There was a night, 9 days into the search, that search dog handler Ben Sorensen still describes in detail decades later. His dog, a bloodhound named Duke trained on scent articles, had been brought in from a neighboring county on day 2 and worked the grid in rotating shifts alongside 3 other dog teams. By day 9, most of the original search area had been covered twice, and command had begun expanding the perimeter outward in wider, less promising rings. Sorensen remembers working a stretch near 3 a.m., his headlamp the only light for a quarter mile, cold enough that his water bottle had begun to skin over with ice at the surface. Duke picked up something. Not a clear trail, Sorensen was careful to specify, but a change in behavior, a tightening of focus near a culvert beneath the service road. The kind of response that could mean anything from a genuine scent article to a rabbit that had crossed the same ground hours earlier. "You learn not to say anything on the radio until you're sure," Sorensen said, "because everyone listening is a parent or a friend of the parent or someone who's been awake for 2 days hoping for exactly this. I called it in as a possible area of interest. I didn't call it a discovery. There's a difference. And it's the difference between giving someone hope and giving someone a promise you can't keep." The culvert was searched at first light. It held nothing beyond old leaves and a family of field mice that scattered when the grate was lifted. Sorensen has said that of everything he did across 9 days on that search, the radio call he's proudest of is the one he didn't make. The moment he chose caution over the temptation to give an exhausted command post something that felt, for a few minutes at 3 a.m. like it might be real. That was the shape the case took for years afterward. Not a dead end exactly, but 3 doors that each opened onto another closed door. Sheriff's Detective Marion Ruiz, who inherited the file in 2004 after Bell retired, described it plainly in a later interview. "We didn't have one piece of evidence that ruled anything out. We just ran out of places to point the search." By 2003, the volunteer search had formally ended, though Daniel continued walking sections of the forest alone on weekends for years afterward. The file was never closed, but it moved, as these cases often do, into a drawer reserved for cases waiting on something. A confession, a body, a break nobody could predict. What stayed with investigators wasn't a specific clue. It was the shape of everything that wasn't there. Grief, in a case with no resolution, doesn't move the way people expect it to. There's no clear arc from devastation to acceptance. Instead, there are years that simply accumulate, each one changing the shape of the loss without ever quite closing it. By 2006, Daniel had left his ranger post at that particular district, transferring to a station 40 minutes away. Not because he stopped caring about the search, he was careful to clarify later, but because he couldn't do his job anymore in a place where every trail he checked was also a trail he'd once searched for his son. His wife, Marianne, had left 2 years earlier, not out of anger, but because the two of them had found they grieved in incompatible ways. Daniel needed to keep the land close, to keep looking. Marianne needed distance, a life in which the forest wasn't the last thing she saw every morning through the kitchen window. Ethan's older sister, Kayla, was 11 in 2001. She would have turned 31 the year the case reopened. In an interview conducted after the reopening, Kayla, reserved, precise in her language in a way that suggested years of practice controlling it, described a specific memory from the winter after her brother disappeared. Her father had kept Ethan's boots by the front door, she said, not out of any stated plan, simply because moving them felt like a decision no one in the house was prepared to make. I stopped inviting friends over, she said, not because anyone said anything wrong, just, how do you explain a pair of 6-year-old's boots that have been sitting by the door for 4 years? There's no good way to bring that up to a 12-year-old friend from school. Marianne Carter reached years later after she had rebuilt a life 2 states away, spoke about that period with a caution that suggested she'd rehearsed how much of it she was willing to say out loud. She didn't blame Daniel for staying, she said, and she didn't want to be characterized as having given up. I needed to be somewhere the search wasn't the first thing I saw every morning, she said. That's not the same as stopping. I just couldn't survive it the way he could, by staying inside it. She kept a photograph of Ethan on her nightstand for the rest of her life in that house, she said, but she stopped being able to drive past the turnoff to the park without pulling over. The hardest part, she said, wasn't the disappearance itself. It was the specific, ongoing indignity of a case with no shape, no funeral to plan, no grave to visit, nothing that let grief settle into a form she recognized. People kept asking if there was any news, she said, for years, and every time you have to decide how much of the truth to give them, that there wasn't, that there might never be, that you'd stopped being sure what news you were even hoping for anymore. A local reporter named Grace Delgado covered the story in its first year and returned to it twice more. Once for a 5-year anniversary piece in 2006, and again, briefly, for a 10-year retrospective in 2011. She remembers the difference between those 2 visits distinctly. In 2006, the community still organized annual searches each September, drawing 60 or 70 volunteers who walked familiar grids out of a kind of collective stubbornness. By 2011, that number had dropped to under 15, not from a lack of care, Delgado said, but because there's a limit to how long a town can hold its breath. The hardest interview I ever did was with Daniel Carter in 2011, Delgado said. I asked him gently whether he still believed Ethan might be found alive, and he sat there for what felt like a full minute before he answered. He said, I've stopped needing him to be alive. I just need to know. I've thought about that sentence for years. Detective Otis Bell retired in 2004 with the case still open on his desk. One of 3 files from his career he later admitted he took home in photocopied form, unofficially, because he couldn't make himself stop thinking about them. He reviewed the Carter file privately every few years, he said, less out of active investigation than out of a habit he couldn't break. Reading through old interview transcripts, looking for something he might have missed the first 4 times through. In 2009, Bell drove out to the old campground alone on the anniversary and walked the same stretch of service road the search teams had covered in 2001. He has said, since, that he doesn't know exactly what he was looking for. Some cases you close because they're solved. Some you close because there's nothing left to do. This one never let me close it either way. None of these years produced new evidence. What they produced instead was a kind of permanent, quiet architecture around the case. A family reorganized around an absence. A community that slowly, unevenly, let its attention move elsewhere. And a handful of people who never quite managed to. In early 2024, the Montana Department of Natural Resources began a records modernization project, digitizing decades of archived search and rescue radiologs that had been stored on analog reel-to-reel tape since before most current staff were hired. The goal wasn't investigative. It was archival, preserving fragile recordings before the tape degraded past recovery. Magnetic tape from that era doesn't fail gracefully. It deteriorates in a way technicians call sticky shed syndrome, where the binder holding the magnetic particles to the tape breaks down, and a reel played too many times without treatment can shed its own data permanently. Audio technician Wendy Palko was 3 months into the project when she reached the September 2001 reels. She worked out of a converted storage room in the county records building, headphones on for 8-hour stretches, logging timestamps into a spreadsheet, while the reel-to-reel machine turned at a slow, steady hiss beside her. Most of the traffic was routine: unit check-ins, weather updates, coordination between search grids. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She was cataloging. She has since described the work as strangely intimate, spending months inside other people's worst days, one radio transmission at a time, without any of them knowing a stranger in 2024 was listening. "You start to recognize voices," she said. "Not names. Just, this dispatcher sounds tired by hour 6. This searcher's voice cracks a little every time he says a number over the radio, like he's bracing for what it might mean." At the 41-minute mark of a tape logged from the second day of the Carter search, a transmission lasting 9 seconds caught her attention. Not because of its content, which sounded unremarkable on first listen, but because it had never been transcribed in the original 2001 case file. And Palko had learned by then to notice when a timestamp on tape didn't correspond to anything in the digital records she'd been given as a reference. She played it back 4 times. A search and rescue volunteer, call sign unclear on the damaged tape, reported seeing a parked vehicle on a service road roughly 2 miles from the campground, sometime before the search had officially begun. The transmission was answered by dispatch, with a brief acknowledgement and nothing more. No follow-up, no request for details, no indication anyone had flagged it as relevant. 9 seconds. A vehicle. A timestamp that placed it hours before Ethan Carter was reported missing. Palko sat with the recording for nearly 20 minutes before she did anything with it, running the math in her head, checking the case name against the folder label 3 separate times to make sure she hadn't mismatched a file. She remembers a very specific, unglamorous feeling. Not excitement exactly, more like a held breath. "I wasn't thinking. I've solved something. I was thinking. Someone needs to hear this who actually knows what it means." In 2001, Dispatch had been managing dozens of transmissions an hour across multiple frequencies during the height of the search, with 3 separate agencies coordinating on overlapping channels. The report, made by a volunteer who wasn't part of the primary search grid and who left the area before the search wound down, was logged onto tape but never flagged for follow-up. Not out of negligence, investigators would later stress, but because a single frequency dispatcher managing that volume of traffic in the first chaotic hours had no realistic way to weigh the significance of every call in real time. It sat, unheard by investigative eyes, for 23 years. If you've ever wondered how much of the past might still be sitting in boxes and drives, unexamined simply because no one had reason to look, this is what that looks like in practice. Palko flagged the recording to her supervisor, who, recognizing the case name from a 5-year retrospective article he vaguely remembered, forwarded it to the county sheriff's office with a note that read, "In full. Might be nothing. Might not be. Case name is Carter." The file, technically still open though dormant for over a decade, landed on Detective Ruiz's desk the following week, alongside 11 other unrelated tips generated by the same digitization project, most of which, Ruiz has said, turned out to be exactly nothing. "I remember reading the transcript and thinking, this changes what we know about that morning," Ruiz said. "Not because it solves anything, because it means there was a piece of the timeline we never had. Before she went to Daniel, Ruiz first needed to identify who had made the original transmission. The call sign on the tape was partially degraded, but combined with the day's assignment sheet, her team narrowed it to a volunteer named Tom Whitfield, who had driven up from a neighboring county in 2001 to help with the search and had never been contacted again once the volunteer effort wound down. Whitfield was 68 when Ruiz's team found him, still living in the same town, and he remembered the day with a clarity that surprised even him. "I remember thinking it wasn't important enough to make a big deal of," he said. "I saw a truck parked on that access road on my way in that morning, before anybody even knew a kid was missing yet. I mentioned it on the radio because that's what we'd been told to do. Report anything out of place. Nobody ever asked me about it again, so I figured it hadn't mattered." When Ruiz told him, 23 years later, that his 9-second radio call had become the thread that reopened the entire case, Whitfield was quiet on the phone for long enough that she asked if he was still there. "I've thought about that search every September for 23 years. He finally said, "I never once thought about that truck. Not once." You don't know which 5 seconds of your life are going to matter until somebody calls you up decades later and tells you. Ruiz drove out to see Daniel Carter in person rather than call. She has said since that she'd learned over the years that some news deserves a face in the room, even when the news itself is only a possibility. Daniel was living alone by then, in a small house outside the district he used to patrol. He listened to the 9-second recording twice, sitting at his kitchen table before he said anything. "He asked me if it meant anything," Ruiz recalled. "I told him the truth, that I didn't know yet, but that it was the first genuinely new piece of information in 20 years, and that alone was worth chasing." He nodded for a long time. Then he asked if he could listen to it one more time before I left. Reopening a 23-year-old case meant reconstructing a version of that weekend that no longer existed in memory, only in paper. Ruiz's team began pulling every surviving record connected to the campground and the surrounding roads: park maintenance logs, seasonal employee access books, fuel purchase receipts from the 2 gas stations within driving distance, and vehicle registration records held by the State Department of Transportation. The first 2 weeks produced nothing but frustration. Roughly a third of the maintenance logs from that period had been water damaged in a records room flood in 2015, and the surviving pages were incomplete, some entries illegible where ink had bled through. Ruiz's team spent days simply reconstructing which documents still existed before they could begin comparing them to anything. Individually, these documents had seemed irrelevant in 2001. Cross-referenced against the newly recovered timestamp, they began to align in ways the original investigation had never had reason to test. The maintenance log showed that one seasonal worker, employed on a short-term contract that ended the week after Ethan's disappearance, had signed out a department vehicle that Sunday morning for a task not otherwise documented on his assigned schedule. His name was Ray Kessler. His 2001 interview, still on file, stated he had spent the morning at a personal residence 40 minutes from the park, an account no one had cross-checked against fuel or mileage records at the time because there had been no reason to doubt it. He'd been one name on a list of a dozen, cleared in the same brief round of interviews that cleared everyone else. Before the fuel records could confirm anything, Ruiz's team chased 2 other leads that came out of the same document review, both of which in the end went nowhere, and both of which cost real time. A separate maintenance worker's mileage log showed an unexplained gap the same weekend, and for 4 days the team treated it as a promising second thread, until they discovered the man had simply forgotten to log a trip to pick up his daughter from a soccer tournament, confirmed by a tournament roster still archived by the local youth league. A DOT record also flagged an unregistered vehicle reported on a nearby highway that Sunday, which consumed another week of tracing before it was identified as a farm vehicle with an expired but harmless registration, owned by a rancher, two properties over who had no connection to the park at all. "That's the part people don't see in these cases," Ruiz said. "For every thread that leads somewhere, there are three that don't, and you don't get to skip them. You have to walk each one all the way to the end, because you don't know which one it is until you're standing at the end of it." The Kessler thread was different. The fuel purchase receipts told a story the mileage log by itself hadn't. A fuel purchase log that morning, using a department card assigned to his vehicle, placed him 9 miles from where he claimed to be, on a road that connected directly to the service route mentioned in the recovered transmission. The receipt had a specific timestamp, 9:14 a.m., nearly 7 hours before Ethan went missing, but on the same access road a volunteer would later report seeing a parked vehicle later that same day. Ruiz's team located Kessler, now in his 60s and living in a different state, and requested a new interview. He agreed. Ruiz has said she expected some resistance and got almost none, which she found, in hindsight, telling in its own way. People who have nothing to hide usually ask why you're asking. He didn't ask. He just said, "Okay." The account he gave in 2024 no longer matched the one he had given in 2001. Small details shifted first. "You said in 2001 you were at your residence that whole morning," Ruiz said to him, according to interview notes later entered into the case file. "But the fuel record puts your department vehicle 9 miles from there." "I might have run an errand," Kessler said. "That was a long time ago. I don't remember every stop I made." "The errand happens to be on the same road a volunteer reported a parked vehicle on, later that day." A pause. "There's a lot of vehicles use that road. There's a department fuel card that says yours was one of them." It was a small crack, nothing close to an admission, but Ruiz has said it was the first moment in 23 years the case had a genuine pressure point. A place where a story pressed against a fact and gave, even slightly. "People don't lie forever expecting to get caught," Ruiz reflected. "They lie because the lie worked the first time, and nothing ever came back to test it again." What finally moved the case wasn't a confession in that first new interview. It was the accumulation. A vehicle on a road it shouldn't have been on. A fuel receipt that placed a man where he said he wasn't. A maintenance record with no matching task. And a radio transmission that had waited 23 years to be heard by someone who knew what it meant. The second interview with Ray Kessler took place 6 weeks later, after Ruiz's team had secured phone carrier records from 2001. Difficult to obtain given the age of the case, requiring a court order and weeks of back and forth with a carrier that had since merged twice, and a statement from a witness who had never been formally interviewed the first time around. That witness was a man named Harold Pruitt, who in 2001 had worked part-time at one of the 2 gas stations near the park, and remembered when Ruiz's team eventually tracked him down, a specific customer from that Sunday morning. Not because anything about him stood out at the time, but because Pruitt had, by coincidence, mentioned the man to a coworker later that same week, before either of them had any reason to think it mattered. "I remembered him because he paid for gas and a pack of cigarettes with exact change, down to the penny, like he'd counted it out in the car before he came in," Pruitt said. And he didn't make eye contact. Not in a suspicious way, particularly, just standoffish. "I only remembered the exact change thing because I mentioned it to my coworker at the time. Something like, 'Had a weird one this morning.' And she remembered it too when the sheriff's office called her, years apart, both of us." Pruitt had never been interviewed in 2001 because the original canvass of gas stations had focused on out-of-area vehicles, and Kessler's truck, registered locally, hadn't matched the profile investigators were screening for. It was, Ruiz has said, one of the clearest examples in the case of how a reasonable investigative filter, screened for out-of-state or unfamiliar vehicles, had inadvertently screened out the answer. Confronted with Pruitt's account, the fuel records and phone tower data placing his 2001 cell phone near the service road at a time that further narrowed the window, Kessler's story began to fully give way. "I wasn't going to hurt anyone," he told Ruiz, according to the recorded interview. That was never the plan that morning." "Then tell me what the plan was," Ruiz said. There was a long silence on the recording at this point. Ruiz has said it ran nearly 40 seconds, an eternity in an interview room, and that she made herself sit through it without feeling it, a technique she'd learned early in her career. "Silence," she said, "does more work than a question sometimes. It gives a person room to hear their own account out loud before they've said it, and to decide, in that private half-minute, whether they can still live inside the version they've been telling for 23 years. I saw him by the shed," Kessler finally said. "He was alone. I wasn't thinking anything, not at first. I stopped the truck. And then I made a decision I can't take back, and I've had 23 years to wish I hadn't." He would not, even then, describe the specifics of what followed in a single continuous account. What followed, over the course of 90 minutes, was not a clean confession delivered all at once, but a slow, halting narrative, revised twice even as he gave it, the kind of statement investigators are trained to expect from someone who has spent 23 years building a version of events he has, on some level, come to believe himself, and who is only now, in real time, watching it come apart. Ruiz described his tone throughout as strangely flat, almost administrative, as though he were reciting a story that had long since stopped feeling like something he'd actually done. At one point, according to Ruiz, Kessler asked whether Daniel Carter still lived in the area. "Not to reach out," he clarified quickly, when Ruiz didn't answer right away. I've wondered all these years if he ever stopped looking." Ruiz didn't tell him. She has said she considered the question itself a kind of answer to something she hadn't asked, a small, involuntary admission that he had spent 23 years thinking about the exact family whose lives his silence had frozen in place. Ruiz has declined to detail every element of that interview publicly, citing the family's privacy, but confirmed that by its end, Kessler's account, corroborated over the following weeks by cell tower data, a partial secondary witness statement, and physical evidence recovered based on details from his statement, was sufficient to formally close the case. In early 2025, the Montana Sheriff's Office announced that the case of Ethan Carter, missing since September 2001, had been formally resolved, and that Ray Kessler, the seasonal maintenance worker who had left the state shortly after his contract ended in 2001, had been identified and charged, based primarily on evidence assembled from the reopened investigation. For Daniel Carter, now in his 60s, the resolution didn't arrive the way he had once imagined it might. There was no single dramatic breakthrough, no moment of vindication captured on camera. There was a phone call from Detective Ruiz, a quiet conversation, and after 23 years, an answer to a question that had shaped nearly half his life. He has described the days afterward as strange in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I used to think I'd feel something enormous," Daniel said. "Mostly I just felt tired. Tired in a way that finally had somewhere to rest." He said he drove to the old campground alone the week after the announcement. The same drive Otis Bell had once made on an anniversary years earlier, though Daniel didn't know that at the time. He didn't walk far. He sat at the picnic table near where the equipment shed used to stand. It had been replaced twice since 2001 and stayed there until it got dark, not searching for anything this time, just sitting with a version of the place that finally had an ending attached to it. Kayla Carter reached for comment after the announcement, said the resolution didn't erase 23 years, and she was careful not to pretend it had. "It doesn't give me my brother back," she said. "It just means we're not standing in the dark anymore. There's a difference, and it matters, even if it's not the difference people expect." News of the reopening had reached the town months before the arrest. Once word spread that sheriff's vehicles had been seen at the old records building more than once in a single season. Enough, in a town that size, to start conversations at the diner counter and the hardware store checkout line. Grace Delgado, the reporter who had covered the case at 5 years and again at 10, found herself fielding calls from residents asking, cautiously, whether she'd heard anything, long before her own sources at the sheriff's office would confirm a word. "It was strange," she said. The town had spent 2 decades slowly letting the case become something in the past tense. And then, almost overnight, it became present tense again for everybody, whether they were ready or not. When the arrest was finally announced, Delgado said, "The diner was unusually quiet the next morning. Not somber exactly, just careful. The way a room gets when everyone in it is turning the same news over privately before anyone says it out loud." Judith Farrow, the retired schoolteacher who once mistook a stranger's rotted shoe for her nephew's classmate's little brother, still lives in the county. She said she cried when she read the news, not out of shock, but out of something closer to relief on someone else's behalf. The specific, second-hand relief of a community that had carried a small piece of this case for 23 years without ever being asked to. Otis Bell, the original detective, long retired, was among the first people Ruiz called once the case was formally closed. He didn't say much, by her account. He asked one question, whether the answer had been sitting in a document his team had already collected in 2001. And when Ruiz told him yes, in a sense, though it took a recording no one had heard to know which document mattered, he was quiet for a while before he thanked her. What strikes investigators most about this case isn't the discovery itself, but how ordinary the missed connection turned out to be. Not a cover-up, not a conspiracy, simply a 9-second recording that no one in 2001 had the time or reason to hear twice. It raises a question worth sitting with. How many other answers are waiting in boxes not yet opened, on tapes not yet played? Would you have caught that transmission, buried in hours of routine radio traffic? It's the kind of detail easy to imagine skipping past, and impossible to unhear once you know what it meant. This story has been a fictional narrative, inspired by the kinds of investigative patterns and human situations real families and detectives encounter in long unresolved missing persons cases. It was written for entertainment and reflection, not as an account of real events or real people. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this case moved you, we'd genuinely like to know what you think you would have noticed first. The recording, the fuel receipt, or the exact change at the gas station counter. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you appreciated how this story was told, a like helps more than you might expect. And if investigative documentary storytelling is something you want more of, consider subscribing. We'll see you in the next case.